Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And this morning, a very, very interesting conversation with David Cranmer Underdown continues. If you recall, the last time we were together, we were positing a number of interesting issues. One of them was about Edgar Kaiser and why did he buy a house at 100 Underdown Road, asks David Cranmer Underdown. Well, let's start there and see where our conversation goes today. Thanks for being with us, and we will get started in just a moment. And welcome back to McDuff Lives, everyone, and a special welcome to our good friend and guest today, David Cranmer Underdown. Hello, David. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me again, John.
Hey, I see that you got the message about the blue shirt today. That's great, man. I don't know how these messages float through the ether, but somehow we end up color coordinated more often than not.
Well, with the Cowboys and the Yankees, we're with the Cowboys today.
Oh God, I hate to say it's just think that, being an old Redskins fan, and yeah, I still say Redskins, don't I?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, David, your personal history fits in to the big picture of American history in remarkable ways. And we were exploring a number of those last time, 2 weeks ago, here at McDuff Lives with you. Uh, the question was raised, why would Edgar Kaiser purchase a residence at 100 Underdown Road? And first of all, your name being Underdown, can you explain why Underdown Road is named Underdown? And then let's get some deep background on Edgar Kaiser and see why it's so important to study people like Edgar Kaiser and what he did during his life.
Well, the story of Underdown Road is it was my great grandfather who was named William Edward Underdown, that was a Cornell Agricultural School graduate, and he grew up in Trumansburg, New York, with his wife, who was my great grandma, who was named Helen Douglas. And he was recruited by a man named Alex Dow to be the farm manager for the Huron Farms Company, which was buying property along the rivers for hydroelectric power projects in Michigan. One of them being Willow Run Airport, which is why Edgar Kaiser moved um, to uh, to Barton Hills, Michigan, which my great grandfather subdivided with the Olmsted family, their landscape architectural firm. So they
The famous Olmsted family, the designers, I think, of Chicago's Central Park
Central Park. They did the mall in Washington D.C. They did the
Mall.
Emerald Necklace in Boston.
Yeah.
They're the thing is they're very famous for landscape architecture, but they also co-founded the Union League Club, which was the early sanitation systems in New York City. If you know the Union League Club, it's one of the really old blue blood clubs that was interested in bringing water and sanitation into New York City, just like Aaron Burr and the Manhattan Company originally. So that was um, the background of my great grandfather and his brother Milton Underdown. He worked for the Secretary of War, um, Undersecretary of War, as his assistant, who did super projects like dams. I mean, he was the head of the engineering corps for West Point, and so that was the background of them. But my great grandfather was recruited by Alex Dow, and historically he's interesting because he was the man that introduced Henry Ford to Thomas Edison at an 1898 Edison meeting in New York City. So that put, Ford worked for the Detroit Edison Company also before he met Thomas Edison and was, he pitched the idea of the automobile. Edison was very supportive, and so Henry Ford then got into the car business. And so that is why, when my great grandma has these, claims about Henry Ford, it's not like they weren't intimately connected, because Alex Dow was also part of the Detroit Aircraft Company with Henry Ford and Edsel Ford and Charles Kettering and William Bushnell Stout. So he was connected to what became Lockheed also, because after Detroit Aircraft Company was collapsed, I don't know if you're getting feedback.
Well, I am hearing some clicking that might represent soft. Often when people are moving things around on their desk, it sounds like that.
Okay, I'll try to be still. I'm getting feedback though.
Oh,
does it sound better? No, it's still. Should I leave and come back?
Let's try it. I think that might work.
Okay.
It doesn't. Okay, Willie says it's echoing there, so yeah, we'll get you back. And here comes my producer with a similar message.
Yeah, there's a bad echo on David.
Interesting. Okay. Go in my studio and see if StreamYard is on and turn it off. That could be it. David, are you back?
I'm back. I had terrible feedback. I couldn't hear anything. It was feedbacking so loud that I was couldn't concentrate. But
interesting. Mars is checking to see how it's going now.
I don't know if people could hear it, but for my thing, it was very distracting. So it's just not doing it now, though. But just to summarize, so the end of the summary was the Underdown Road was where my great grandfather settled his family working for the Edison Company. He passed away in 1930 in a car crash. And then it wasn't until after the war that Edgar Kaiser moved. So it wasn't until, 1948. So it was, 17 years later that he moved there. But when he did, he was running the Willow Run factory, which is famous because that was the Rosita Riveter. And it was where Lindbergh and Ford and Edsel Ford. And they also had the intrigue with Kaiser in Israel and Kaiser in Argentina and Kaiser in the Netherlands. And my belief is that the tooling from the consolidated B-24 was, divided and given to those different countries.
Back up on Kaiser now. He's from California, if I recall.
Oakland, California. Mm-hmm.
And was he born rich or made rich, or what happened?
Well, he got early asphalt deals. He did paving in I think Puerto Rico in like the teens, and then he got involved in the Hoover Dam project. So his company, Kaiser Construction, partnered with Bechtel of California. So Bechtel and Kaiser were the combined company, and then of course John McCone's Consolidated Engineering was folded into the Bechtel Kaiser, and then McCone was of course the CIA director during the assassination, and your father's high school rival, George P. Schultz, was also a massive player in the Bechtel Kaiser orbit historically.
And is this Kaiser aluminum?
Everything. Kaiser Permanente, Kaiser Shipbuilding. They did the key system with Joe Kennedy, which was doing the moving the material around the port of Oakland and San Francisco. And they also did the Kaiser helicopters. The other intrigue with them was that Timothy Leary was working for them when he was working for the Kaiser Family Foundation in Oakland, California, before he went to Harvard. He was working for Kaiser. So, that's another thing, because then Leary later ends up at the Millbrook estate, which is the, Mellon family. And so that is another connection more with my mom's side of the family that I can get into with the Harvard stuff. But he was a big player. And then also look up the Kaiser International, because they did the deal with Israel in 1948 during the Israeli-Arab War, And the person that Ephraim Illian, who did the deal with Marcus Seif, who was the quartermaster for the Israeli army in that period, and also their family had the department stores in England. They did the arms deal with Czechoslovakia with Jan Masaryk, who's was the protege of Edward Beneš.
Well,
And
wait a minute. I thought that was Robert Maxwell.
after he died, he came in, but the guys they worked with were the Kaiser Fraser people. So Masaryk was the son of Thomas Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia. He's the one that moved to Chicago in 1915, set up the Czechoslovakian intelligence network paralleled with William Wiseman in New York. He was working with the University of Chicago and Charles Crane. He met with Edwin Mandel House and with the Dulles brothers' uncle, Robert Lansing, to get recognition for Czechoslovakia. This is after World War I. And Edward Beneš was his protege. And that was, he became the president of Czechoslovakia after Masaryk, got old. And then Jan Masaryk, his son, became Beneš's protege. And so when the, Nazis go into Czechoslovakia and they flee, they set up the Czech government in exile in London. And that's where you get Joseph Korbel, the father of Madeleine Albright, was working for them, for him. And they did Operation Anthropod, where they killed Reinhard Heydrich, for the Final Solution. He was in charge of that. The movie Casablanca is based on the Czechoslovakian resistance movement. So this Jan Masaryk, after World War II, does the deal with Israel to sell military surplus from Czechoslovakia. He does the deal in January of 1948. In February of 48, the Russians invade and take over Czechoslovakia. It becomes a communist nation. In March, he's thrown out the window and dead. And then his niece, who, the Ava, ends up in the preschool with my mom in Bloomington, Indiana. She was in the Quonset Hut preschool. So that's the sequence of events on the, Cold War. And yeah, Bob Maxwell came in and, could speak Russian and, had the relationships with the communists that had just came in. But that was the pretext for NATO, was the Czechoslovakian coup in 48. And that was the need for a, unified defense of Europe. So that was that's the context of the, characters.
So I guess the answer to the test is Edgar Kaiser moved to 100 Underdown Road in order to supervise the Willow Run project. And
Right.
Is that it?
Yeah, but the thing is, the Willow Run project is layered because they did the Bomark missile there. The Boeing and the Mark is the Michigan Aeronautical Research Center. It was the first surface-to-air intercontinental ballistic missile was developed at Willow Run. They also did the Ford nuclear reactor under the Phoenix. They had a thing called the Phoenix program, which was a World War II memorial program where the Ford, instead of going to Israel and, because again, it's like, well, why would Henry Ford and Edsel be, going into Israel? Weren't they, the ones that had the, Dearborn Independent and, Edsel was on the IG Farben board. So it's not a good match. So you bring Kaiser in, and then you have the Ford Foundation come in with Horace Rowland Gaither. And then the Fords are, kind of, they still do the cars, but now they have the Ford Foundation and the Rand Corporation is all, through Ford interests. And this is where the, the death of Edsel Ford and then Henry Ford coming in, and then, the young Henry Ford II coming in and having these, powerful mentors like the Whiz Kids come in. They bring in the Whiz Kids, and then they also have the Sidney Weinberg of Goldman Sachs providing a lot of guidance to the Ford family. And of course, Sidney Weinberg was also the person that guided Dwight Eisenhower. So
it sounds like there's incredible connections that you're able to pin together that 99% of us wouldn't see. And this to me is very, very important that we continue to dig into this, because, Henry Ford, was famously anti-Semitic, publishing the protocols and all of that. Is he is I don't know. I mean, the Ford why did they start the Ford Foundation, for instance? Whose idea was it? Hey, let's have a foundation and give away a bunch of money.
So we're in the exact same period. We're post World War II. We've just done the Manhattan Project. We've had the Rad Lab has created the radars and the proximity fuse and the atomic bomb. So you have all of these, and then you also have the Alsace mission where you go in to Europe and you're trying to acquire all of these industrial processes and intellectual property and all the IG Farben, because everything had been nationalized, so they'd really rolled things up, and so these assets were all fought over. And the problem is that with the Holocaust, you had a very strong group that felt some people deserved to get nothing because of that, and that created a lot of problems, because that now you're trying to weigh whether how involved they were and whatnot, and and that became a big problem. And of course, the SACO was a big part of that. That's the Silesian American Mining Company that was with Dulles and Operation Sunrise. But that was the Brown Brother Harriman group and the um, Anaconda Copper, which was Rockefeller and Guggenheim interests. So it's all the same characters, but they really they wanted to have like super bad guys that basically you could take all their stuff and righteously, divide it as spoils of war. And so it gets very confusing, because a character like Henry Ford, who was like you said, he did he had a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which his editor had come from the Detroit News, which is the Scripps Booth family, by the way, which is the other very close family to my dad's family. But that the person that busted the Protocols of Zion was Alan Dulles. When he was stationed in Istanbul in 1922, he was the one that identified it as a forgery. So again, these stories are hard, because they're very ingrained in people's consciousness of being, these are the facts, and he was anti-Semitic, and Lindbergh is the same story. But they Lindbergh specifically went from a aviation hero to having his child famously stolen with like Wild Bill Donovan and Hoover and Schwarzkopf, leading the investigation. Then he goes to Germany, where he's partnering with the Luftwaffe. Then he moves to Cranbrook, to Bloomfield Hills, with Henry Booth is the one that brought him there, and he's now consulting for Willow Run, which we're talking about, where Edgar Kaiser comes in later. And so there was a group called the America First Committee, which Ford and Lindbergh were very closely associated with, and it was before Pearl Harbor. They were pacifists, and that they were partnered with Yale Law School people, because it was the Stewart family. The Quaker Oats guy was the main sponsor of it, but you had like Gerald Ford was part of it, and Sergeant Shriver was part of it. So you have all these characters that are in this America First thing, but historically, I feel like people just remember Ford and Lindbergh because they were kind of the fallen heroes. And so that's for me why it's like analyzing these things, because like and why, like when you said like my perspective is important, is because like I feel like with you I can talk about Ed Lansdale versus Bill Harvey, and which interests wanted Lansdale to be a good guy and not say anything about his bad stuff, and which people wanted Bill Harvey to be the plotter and the bad guy. And he had the intrigues with Cambridge Five. He got in the fights with Guy Burgess and with Philby, and so it to me it seems like the winner of all these interactions was Angleton, that came out on top. But that's but again, like I like to really hash out the characters and what the rivalries were, because um, I think it's important to talk about that, because to me, that's the debate, and the way that you really get like good understanding of these issues is by, discussing them, and, giving theories and things, and then having a, critical analysis and counterpoints.
So Alan Dulles revealed, quote unquote, the Protocols of Zion as being a forgery, and I think his story is that it was done by Russian, the White Russian, or the Imperial Russian Intelligence Service. Does Henry Ford know that when he's publishing the Protocols of Zion as if they were, genuine?
Well, again, like the Ford buildup is very important, because he went from Detroit Edison to starting the Ford Motor Company. He was sponsored by a guy named Alexander Malkovich, who was a coal baron with Edison Company, and he went bankrupt in his first shot at a car company, and so he used the Dodge brothers as his vendor, and he couldn't pay them. So when they did the second edition of Ford Motor, you had the Dodge interests in the 10% ownership of Ford, and then they had their own Dodge Motor Company. And then, if you remember, during World War I, the Dodge brothers died, and then the widows sell it to the Dillon Reed interests, and this is where like Henry Draper and Douglas Dillon and Forrestal come in, because they were all bankers for Dillon Reed, and they were doing reconstruction from World War One.
And
And they
that
also,
Dillon Reed crowd is supposedly quite anti-Semitic at the time too, right?
well, Douglas Dillon is Jewish. Dillon is not his real name. He changed his name
Okay.
to Dillon, but he's a Jewish banker. But Henry Draper is the biggest eugenicist, white shoe elitist you'll ever find. I mean, he founded the eugenics thing with Mary Harriman. So I mean, and then his grandson is Tim Draper, that has Draper Jervison now, and then Tim Draper's daughter was best friends with Elizabeth Holmes of Thermanos, and he was the investor in that. Of course, Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Schultz, were the ones all involved in the Theranos scandal. So again, you go back to these Bechtel, Kaiser, California characters with George Schultz. It's in the middle of all of it.
So Dillon, who's actually Jewish, is the head of Dillon Reed, and I know James Forrestal is reputedly quite anti-Semitic.
Importantly, too,
Okay.
because he and Marshall were the ones that were trying to convince Truman not to recognize Israel, and it's Clark Clifford that convinced him. And then Clifford becomes the head of Point Four with Bill Casey, and at the end of his career, he's the BCCI chairman, and he goes down famously as the head of BCCI during the Iran-Contra scandal. But he was the man that convinced Truman to not listen to Forrestal and not listen to George Marshall, and to recognize Israel. So there's a very important anti-Semitic element to Forrestal, because then he later, goes out the window himself.
Yeah, one wonders how that happened.
And his son is adopted by Averell Harriman, if you remember, and his son was blamed for being the one that gave the bad intelligence for DM being assassinated. So they kind of, seems like they like to kind of dump on the same people over and over again, especially after the dad went out the window.
Yeah, that story about Mary Harriman creating the eugenics, maybe my mind is not connecting it, but as I studied the eugenics, with Galton and Davenport and all of those people,
Well,
I don't remember it connecting to the Harrimans. Can you tie that together?
sure. So Cold Spring Harbor was Davenport, and the money behind it was Mary Harriman. So she
Okay.
was the money
So this
behind
is
it, and then they
this
had
is
the guy.
E.H. Harriman's wife, right?
No, his daughter. This is Averell Harriman and Bunny's sister, and she's the one married to C.C. Rumsey. So her um, brother-in-law is Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan married a Rumsey sister. So you've got Donovan married to a Rumsey, and then C.C. Rumsey's married to Mary Harriman. They're all from Buffalo. They're all Buffalo, New York. This is where like the Alfred Sloan is from, and where the Knutsons and everything. So there's a lot of General Motors to Buffalo history. So those are all part of the thing. And again, and then Donovan becomes he's the classmate of FDR at Columbia Law School with Harlan Fiske Stone, who's a Sullivan and Cromwell lawyer and a mentor to the Dulles brothers too. So that's why it's hard for me to parse like the Dulles brothers versus the Roosevelts and the businessmen's plots versus the Roosevelts, because it there's so much crossover among the characters where it's just so blurred.
Are they all just trying to scramble their way up the mountain of gold to the next higher level? So that, in other words, is this just all about how can I make money, even if I have to screw my neighbor, as long as I don't get caught? Or is there some overall plan of, we're going to take over the world, or we're going to take over the United States, or or all these people just like marbles falling through the little marble machine where they're going to fall wherever they're going to fall. And in other words, is there a scheme behind all this to organize all of these people, or are they all just a bunch of rats in a maze trying to get the biggest piece of cheese?
Well, I think like structurally thinking that people are the same is not the goal of the analysis. That I look at that's one of the things that I really try to do is like for the characters I know personally to be very fair with, are they involved in, do they know, because for me, my personal experience is I don't think a lot of the families know the history of their own of their families. And so I try to always be really fair with evaluating people, but but again, the reason why this stuff is so hard is because the guy that also founded the eugenics was named C.C. Little. He was the president of University of Michigan. He was the person that left U of M to found the Jackson Lab in Bar Harbor, which is where they did the mouse, genetics and DNA. And the people that started that Jackson Lab was Roscoe Jackson from Hudson Auto, who was married to one of the Hudson department store nieces. And then Edsel Ford was married to a department store niece, and he co-founded it also. So that was in the 1920s that happened. But Little was a Harvard trained geneticist, and he had been with the Castles at Harvard. And then he was one of the co-founders with Davenport, Mary Harriman. This is at Cold Spring Harbor. And then Margaret Sanger, of course, famously was also in that group. But he was, so that's why like the Ford family is so connected to these things, because at the same time they're starting a genetics mouse lab in Bar Harbor, Maine. They're also buying Ford work in Cologne, Germany, with Konrad Adenauer, who is later the person that is negotiating with the World Jewish Congress leader Natum Goldman for reparations. And like the person that sued Ford originally was Louis Marshall and Samuel Untermeyer. Louis Marshall was the founder of the American Jewish Congress with Jacob Schiff. And that AJC became the where you live in Maryland, the Baltimore, the Bluestein family is very important with Amoco and oil. And again, they did tetraethylene, they did no-knock fuel like General Motors and DuPont, did with Exxon. But again, it's like they became the negotiators of the Holocaust reparations, and they did tetraethylene. But it seems like with post-World War II, they just want to talk about the Union Bank and Brown Brothers Harriman, and we won't talk anything about the Harriman. Harriman will keep off the record, and we'll just say it's all the Bushes and all the Walkers and everything. But this is why I like to talk about these things, because to me, it's all a controlled fight, and they're all in the kind of the secret team model. and the way I see the Kennedys is they are right in the mix with all these characters, and I think that they did. They're the overthrowing group. I think they like to do the coups, and they were partnered with the Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations. These things were all started in the same period when I was talking about with like William Wiseman coming in and Thomas Moserick when they're setting up these intelligence units in the teens during World War I. This is where they're kind of consolidating it with this Council on Foreign Relations. And Elihu Root is the one that is sort of organizing it, and he was the Secretary of War under Teddy Kennedy or Teddy Roosevelt. So, he is that he was the Secretary of War when my great uncle Milton or whatever was working for the undersecretary and then died, in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1907. So, that's why all these things are like very personal, because like I don't know the Douglas name. I don't know which Helen Douglas is. I don't know who she is. I don't have any records on her family. So it's all piecing things together without knowing. I don't have anybody that knows the answers to any of
That's
this.
your grandmother, right?
This is Helen Douglas, the great grandma. She's the one that lived on 101 Underdown Road across the street. She was Vivian Dow's best friend. And, when her husband died, she then moved to the smaller house. But, they had the Michigan Symposium with all the Manhattan Project people was in the summer of 39 before the Einstein Slizard letter was delivered later that year. That like Fermi and Heisenberg, Compton's, they all went to Ann Arbor. So for me, I'm thinking, okay, well, if you're going to go to Ann Arbor for this meeting right before the Manhattan Project, like probably the Detroit Edison guy that did the power for like the Willow Run and the River Rouge factory, which was the largest factory in the world. And Willow Run became the mile-long assembly line where they could build a B-24 every hour. Like, it seems like if you're doing nuclear power and electrical power through nuclear, it seems like Detroit Edison might have been, because the Fermi nuclear plant was the first privately owned nuclear plant in Monroe, Michigan, and that's Detroit Edison. So, and they had the Ford nuclear, the Phoenix program for the Ford, nuclear reactor in Ann Arbor. So, that's why all these relationships with then like Max Fisher and Henry Ford II, where they're the most illogical partners ever, but they're really friends and business partners. So that's why these really important connections are so distorted for me, because the people I knew personally didn't talk about this kind of stuff, and they didn't allude that there were all these deep-seated rivalries and hatreds.
You said a little while ago that the Kennedys were involved in coups, in overthrows. I'm not familiar with that. Tell me why you said that.
So the RCA Corporation, which David Sarnoff did the deal with Joe Kennedy for RKO, and they did the the movies. The United Fruit Company was RCA's Signalcom partner going back to the beginning of RCA. So United Fruit Company has a long legacy, and the United Fruit Company was, involved in the coups and the banana wars and then PB success. And this is where JM Wave Station becomes sort of the launching point for a lot of this stuff. But United Fruit Company is intimately connected. But again, there's the problematic relationship because you have the Lodge family, which is a massive shareholder of United Fruit Company, with the Kennedy rivalry. But again, it's sort of like a Francis Spellman versus the Kennedys, or Bobby Kennedy versus Roy Cohn, where they worked together and then they became rivals. But I don't know how deep the rivalries were, because you had, the Hoffa thing, and he had the, the rivalry with Walter Reuther, who was a big advisor for JFK going into the 60s. But he was the one that kicked the Teamsters out of the UAW. So there was personal animosity with Hoffa and Reuther but you also had the Ruther lived at Paint Creek in Rochester, and Hoffa lived in, Lake Orion. So they were neighbors also. So again, it's like, well, if they really hated each other, would they be neighbor? You know what I mean? It's just like maybe, but it seems like they're more neighbors.
Joe Kennedy was invested in United Fruit Company. Is that right?
RCA. So through RKO, he merged RKO and RCA with David Sarnoff when they did the movie to sound technology in the late 20s. So it's a little bit of a stretch for me. I'm leaping, connecting RCA and United Fruit Company. But my background for doing that is that the person, Owen Young, that did the Dawes plan and then the Young plan was the founder of RCA. And RCA also gathered all of the patents from Marconi, and that involves the Vatican radio and the ITT. So all of these signal comm issues are tied into all this stuff.
Signal comm meaning electronic communications, right?
Telecommunications, electronic communications, also encrypted communication and secret communication.
Let's go over to the chat and see what these guys are talking about. Let's see. Let's do this one. I don't know. Do you work on issues like like Freemasonry and how that business is connected to all that? Truman was a master Mason.
Yeah.
Freemasonry, a crypto Jewish network, according to our friend Brightmore Dinosaur. I think that's a fair appellation from what I've seen. But does the secret societies come into your analysis?
They do, but it's all like when I hear people talk about it, like I don't have those personal experiences, so it's very conflicting. Like our next door neighbor, who was a ball bearing engineer for General Motors, was a Shriner. So he was part of the Shrine, and he gave us tickets to the Shrine Circus when I was a little kid. And he was a great neighbor. And we went to the Shrine Circus. I didn't love circuses, but it was nice. And there was no child trafficking at all. He was a nice old engineer. He gave us tickets. That was what the Shriners were like. So I didn't really know, but I know Charles Coughlin was at the Shrine. Little Flower of Shrine is where Charles Coughlin, would set up shop in Royal Oak. So there's also that packed in. But again, I didn't know one person that went to Shrine for Charles Coughlin. Like my mom's friend that is the biggest, Sacred Heart, U of D Catholic. Her dad was the chief counsel of General Motors. She didn't know anybody that went to Coughlin's church. The only person I knew read about going there was Tom Hayden, who wrote the Port Huron statement for Walter Reuther. The only person I've ever heard about that went to Shrine and heard Coughlin preach live was Tom Hayden.
And when you say went to Shrine, you're referring to the Shrine of the Little Flower, is it called?
Right. It's a church on Woodward Avenue in Royal Oak, Michigan, and there's a Shrine High School associated with it where that I do know people that went to Shrine. It's a good parochial school or whatever, but the church where Coughlin was making his broadcast that came into conflict with Joe Kennedy and with Eugenio Pacelli and with Spellman and Frank Murphy, when they came to Royal Oak to say you need to tone down the rhetoric criticizing the New Deal, that was where they were going, was to Royal Oak. And so that was where my neighbor was. But he, so that was somebody that was a Shriner but never talked about it. I would go over to his house a lot as a kid, and they had Pass, which showed the Tiger baseball games, and they watched a lot of baseball. And I thought it was the most luxurious thing in the world that they had pay TV and could watch baseball, and they were always really cool. Like he never made me feel uncomfortable. I felt like I had a very good radar for odd people or creepy people, and I never got it from him. So that's why a lot of those things. But as far as the Jewish connection, yeah, I think that is important because Moses Michael Hay, who was the Grand Master of the Masons in Boston with like John Hancock and with Sam Adams and the Paul Revere and everybody, he was a Jewish guy, and he was the Turo family, which is associated with Nathan Mayer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore, who are both Masons in Grand Lodge in England. So there is a deep connection with that stuff. But that's but my experience, I never heard anybody talk about the Masons. I know that the Detroit Cass Quarter Masonic Temple is the largest Masonic temple in the world, and I know George Mason was the architect of it, and then Albert Kahn was his protege that did the Arsenal of Democracy and did the 5-year plan for Stalin. So I know those facts, but I never came across the Masonic rituals or the the snatching people and all that stuff. I just never saw it.
I remember when I was very young that my dad took us to I think it was at a flea market over in Alexandria, Virginia. My mom likes to go to flea markets, and this one, they had a Shriners were there with their little clown cars. Did you see the clown cars when you were?
I've seen pictures of it, and I actually looked at them for the first time when you talked about this story before, because I didn't even know that Shriners did the miniature cars. I knew they wore the,
they had the Fez hats.
I knew the Fez. I definitely knew the Fez, but I did not know about the clown cars until later, until you showed that.
Boy, when I think of those Fezes, I think that this is the connection to was it Smyrna and the earlier American ventures into opium trafficking. I just think that there's, that plus the idea of genies and, well, the Sylph, the famous ship,
Mm-hmm.
that all ties in. But you mentioned earlier that people were opposed to the New Deal. Now that sounds like a dividing line, that some people were very much in favor of it and some people were against it. Who among these players was against the New Deal?
Well, this is the American Liberty League story. This is the businessmen's plot. So as Roosevelt is going into office in 1933, there is financial panic starting in Detroit, Michigan at the Union Guardian Trust Bank, where Henry Ford decides not to, bail out the bank personally. So the bank collapses and there's a Michigan banking holiday. That leads to a federal banking holiday in the 1933 Banking Act, or the Glass-Steagall Act. That is created. And also the SEC is created, where Joe Kennedy becomes the first SEC director. But but in 30, so you have this, and this is also the Detroit aircraft ties into this, because Ford was in the Detroit aircraft and that went bankrupt, and then it became Lockheed and moved back to Santa Monica. So all of the going into the New Deal, you have this General Motors fight also. This is the fight with Pierre DuPont and John Jacob Rascab, who are the deep Catholic Knight of Malta guys from Delaware and the whole Brandywine River. And this is why I freak out, because the Brandywine construction is next to me or whatever. They're the DuPont General Motors interest. This is the Ethel Corp interest. This is Charles Kettering in Detroit Aircraft, that was GM's chief chemist, that is in that interest. So Henry Ford is a celebrity CEO. General Motors decides they want to have a celebrity CEO, so they put Alfred Sloan as the CEO. Rascab and Pierre DuPont leave, and they build the Empire State Building with Coleman DuPont, and they become the foundation of what's called American Liberty League. They were the ones that did the businessmen's plot and hired Smedley Butler to have raise the army and take over FDR, because the New Deal, and this is where a lot of the anti-Semitic rhetoric comes in, and where Coughlin is a very important voice, because, and this is my analysis, is that he's a Detroit, he's Canadian originally, but Detroit has started this bankrupt, the collapse of the state banking. He is, dealing with all of the arsenal of democracy people, and this Union Bank goes bankrupt. The Union Building, the Guardian Building, was the headquarters of the U.S. Army. Before the Pentagon. That was where, in World War II, they had headquarters in the Guardian Building. It's also where Jimmy Hoffa had his offices. And when Hoffa disappeared, the guy that took over his office, his son was in my preschool class at Adams School. That was like the dad took over Hoffa's office, and he started Clark Hill, which is a bigger law firm now, but that's the connections on all this stuff, because it's like, we're talking about Lindbergh and Willow Run, and why do they want to build, why do they want to have B-24 so they can do the strategic bombing surveys and have all of these military assets that, the war planners wanted to do different strategies. And so they were working on all this material, and that was where, that's kind of why, like, the question of why is Edgar Kaiser come in. I think he's a sanitized name away from the Ford name with the anti-Semitic stuff. But it seems like Sidney Weinberg and Goldman Sachs kind of took it over anyway, because the Deuce, Hank the Deuce was young. He's 27. They bring in the whiz kids to do a lot of the operational and a lot of the strategy and, planning and all these things. They bring in this MIT, Harvard, group. That's where the Rad Lab was, and where the Harvard Radio Lab. So it's all coming from that same Horace Roland Gaither, the deputy director of Rad Lab, that starts the Ford Foundation, that starts Rand Corporation, that starts the MITRE Corporation, is all like in that nexus right there in 1948. Like all of those things were happening right then. So that's why I focus on that. And it's it is crazy, all of the crossovers of the family connections. But the guy that was in the Detroit Aircraft Company that invented the Ford Trimotor was named William Bushnell Stout. He was the head engineer of Convair during World War II. Convair, they were Rosie the Riveter, but that was also the Fort Worth factory that did the F-111. That was the same. They were partnered.
So you're giving me the impression that the businessman's plot was a reaction to FDR as a person who would spread the wealth to the undeserving, unwashed poor through his ridiculous money giveaway scheme called the New Deal. All these people you've just mentioned, are they all opposed to the New Deal? Or because I think Horace Rowan Gaither, as I have studied, seems to have been okay with that, and in fact, kind of. Well, you tell me, what was Horace Rowan Gaither's position in this fight for or against FDR's New Deal?
Well, he was, to me, was a little bit later generation. But I look at in 33 with all these banking changes, what comes about. You have Reconstruction Finance Committee that's created as sort of a second Federal Reserve, and that's Eugene Mayer that creates that, and then Jesse Jones becomes the leader of that. He's later the Sweet 8F, for people that studied the JFK with the Texas Oil Men and the Sweet 8F. That was Jesse Jones. He took over RFC. Treasury Secretary is Henry Morgenthau, who is the Christmas tree neighbor of FDR in upstate New York. They're neighbors and friends. And then the Federal Reserve Chairman is Mariner Stoddard Eccles. Mariner Stoddard Eccles' grandfather is David Eccles. That was the Utah Company. Utah Company was one of the 6 companies with Kaiser Frazier that did the Hoover Dam with Albert Kahn's brother as the general contractor for it, and his other brother doing the reinforced concrete that, with Ivar Kruger, that gets murdered in Paris and creates the Kruger crash. And then his, assets are scooped up by the Wallenberg family, which is working with, Monet and Moreau, which is the, international banking consortium with Jean Monnet, who goes to Oakland and partners with Bank of America and Transamerica. Then he goes to China and sets up the Chinese Development Bank with H.H. Kung. His lawyers are Sullivan and Cromwell and the Dulles brothers, but they're partnered with basically all of the cabal groups. Is this Monet and Monroe, and then Jean Monnet later becomes the father of the European Union. So that's kind of the flow of the characters. Sorry.
Well, what I wanted to get into though is, where does the New Deal come from? It sounds like all these people are like I described. They're all just trying to work their way into greater wealth, and So who is behind? Is this like Eleanor Roosevelt being a do-gooder, or what?
Yeah, I mean, her brother Hal Roosevelt is the treasurer of Detroit with Frank Murphy as the mayor. This is when the banking collapse happened. So he comes in with no economic background to be the treasurer of the city of Detroit with Frank Murphy, who later, partners with Joe Kennedy and Spellman and Pope Pius to, get Coughlin off the air. So there is that Roosevelt connection that's very intriguing. But to me, this is all the DuPont, the General Motors, DuPont, and the tetraethylene. They want to get away from the ethyl corp with the tetraethylene, and the thing is that like with the new, like I also have the big problem with Ethel DuPont marrying FDR's son after. So, the New Deal was a response to, this is after the Depression. The General Motors and Ford have both done massive investments in Europe. I mean, General Motors had bought Opel in 29. Ford had bought or developed Ford Work in Germany. They did the 5-year plan with Stalin starting in 27, where they built 530 factories in Russia and did basically industrialize Russia. So this is right after all this. And then Ford is the one that does not, save the Union Guardian Bank. And then, of course, the Union Bank name, later comes back, because the Union Bank is that, that was the, Prescott Bush and the Harrimans and the Walkers and everything was Union Bank. So the name Union, becomes a funnel point for the bad guys, basically. And then it seems like people like the Harriman characters, nobody focuses on them after.
Yeah, the Harriman family does kind of sneak through history without getting tagged with anything, although, except for in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where the poor conductor there, I work for E.H. Harriman, the Union Pacific Railroad, right? There's that word union again.
He picked the smart partners, though. He picked the cutthroats. I mean, he was partners with Jacob Schiff, Kuhn and Loeb. He was partners with Robert Fleming. He was with J.P. Morgan. He was with all the cutthroat guys. So, that's what I think happens is you get people that are not, dirty players, and you get dealing with people that are dirty players and don't say it, and people get blindsided.
It sounds like my first law firm. I just took this job in a law firm, and 12 years later, I realized that they were just going to roll me. So I had to get out of there. It was, they seem like nice guys, but no, they're working a plan, and it's all about feathering their own nest and at your expense. And you don't know it because you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and you want to be a contributor to society.
Well, I had a very personal, dichotomy on that, because my grandfather, Underdown, David Jewett Underdown, was angry. I mean, he was not a nice guy, and so we didn't do a lot of stuff with them. And then my grandparents in Indiana were wonderful. So I had one set of grandparents I developed a very close relationship with, and one that we didn't really do a lot with. And so, you know, there's different personalities within the same families and everything. So, and you can't rule out the family feuds too, you know, with, especially when you're talking about the Kennedy stuff. I mean, I feel like um there's a lot of areas with them that would raise red flags, if like the Kit Kennedy marrying the Cavendish, right? Cavendish, he married the Mitford sister. The Mitfords were the beautiful Mitford girls, and you had one that was with Mussolini and one that was partying with Hitler, and like, so you have all these like intrigues because they're like the beautiful it girls. But and like Randolph Churchill was buddies with, and so all these characters like knew each other. And then you had the Lord Moy assassination in Cairo, which is, he was a Guinness. So Diana Mitford married his son after, or she was married to his son first, and then she later married the Oswald Mosley, the fascist English guy. So there was a lot of like conflicting ideologies, and then you also have like the London School of Economics connection with JFK and Joe Kennedy. So like that's why I just kind of put them in the promotion of the East India Company interest kind of basket, that they're working in that sort of world. And that's why, like with the World is a Rich Man's Trick movie, the thesis that like the Kennedys were just so good that it just doesn't hold for me, because they're all complicated characters, and there were certainly a lot of PR that like people hated the Kennedys and that they would do anything to get rid of them. So it's just like the simple thesis like that is really it just needs more, that's why like knowing the individual characters is important, because the things are a mess.
Yeah, and all the rest of us, those of us that don't see, and how deep these conspiracies really lie, are all thinking, hey, we've got a constitution, we've got separation of powers, we've got, all the individual rights, we should be good. But all of that stuff on paper doesn't mean anything if the powerful families and powerful people are able to engineer their own to the whole government to their own benefit, which I think is exactly what's going on right now.
Well,
So it's noon now, so I don't want to stop on a down note like that, but it really is, to me. I have to look at John F. Kennedy's assassination as he is a victim. He is, and as he is a victim, so are the rest of us victims, because the America that we thought we had, and he represented it in his speeches. He did in his inauguration, certainly in the American University speech, where he basically called out the secret societies. And this, the armies, in true infiltration by night and instead of armies by day. Everything has been infiltrated, and since his death, I think it's just become a complete free for all. And I don't see any heroes. So,
well,
but
I agree. I mean, I think his death was a trauma to everybody in the world, and Americans specifically. And, sadly, I think that using that mass trauma was used as a tool to help create a destabilized population where they didn't know, to believe the Warren report or not. And so to get the environment where people were in a fight or flight trauma,
yep.
footing, that's, sadly what the war planners had in mind, and it's very effective. And that's, why why I'm interested in the psychology and sort of the drives and all of those things, because that's, we're talking about getting people to do things they wouldn't normally do because they're, morals or conscious or
Exactly.
beliefs or whatever. They would never do that. And that's why I think right now, where we're at the point where this sort of mech war is like, coming forward with the drones and the drone warfare. And that, if you're a war planner, what more could you want than a robot that, has no feelings and doesn't care at all? And they don't, if they're right or wrong, it doesn't matter. And you have plausible deniability as the war planner, because you can just say that the robot screwed up. It was a glitch. So
The robots ate my homework.
it's Terminator, John. We're gonna have the Terminator 2. We're gonna have Arnold Schwarzenegger coming back with to save us.
Well, the last comment we have here, and I've got to close the show out. Here come the Beatles. So this is where we'll leave it today, and maybe we'll pick up with the Beatles the next time we get together, David.
Perfect. I love it. So we'll have an English invasion next time.
Okay, I look forward to it. All right, everybody, have a great afternoon. I will see you on Thursday, and I'll be off tomorrow. Thanks a lot, David Cranmer, Underdown. Amazing stuff, and always a pleasure. Bye now.
Thank you.